Good morning, everyone. That was brilliant. I don't know what I can add to that story from Ellie right there. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Clayton, and everyone else. I'm really happy to be here with you this morning. I'm Breanna Nickel. I'm an associate professor of Bible and religion at Goshen College. I think this is only my third time in this church space, so it's just really nice to be here this morning. We have, as read by Oliver, we have this wonderful passage from John in front of us today. One of my favorites, actually, so good timing. It's one of those things that we kind of read through, and there's so many details in the story. It's such immensely meaningful. It's such a pivotal moment. It's a pivotal moment for Jesus because he knows that he has limited time left with the disciples. It's a pivotal moment for the disciples because they are having this meal, and they're not quite sure what's going to happen when. So there's a little bit of uncertainty in that room. But I think at the center of this story, we have foot washing, which I'm with you, kiddos, and Ellie. I'm not quite sure about this practice. It makes me a little uncomfortable when I try and do it myself. But at the center of the story, we have this moment where Jesus stands up, gets some water, takes off his outer robe, as the passage tells us, and does this ritual of foot washing. And we've had some debates recently, actually, on Weiss Third at the college about foot washing and rituals in the Bible. And this one in particular is a little bit of that kind of multiple layers of meaning. We can kind of read in between the details of the story, and we can see a couple of things happening. But I always find myself reading too much into this. I'm like, well, it could be so many things. It could be, is it like in the ancient Mediterranean world when you had to wash your feet before you entered a holy space? Does that have something to do with why Jesus is washing feet right now? Is it a holy space all of a sudden? What's going on there? Or is it just part of the meal? Is it just part of a practical meal? Everyone washes their feet before the meal. But in which case, Jesus is doing it wrong because he should have washed their feet as a servant before the meal, not after the meal. And so it's like, wait a second, it can't just be that, It can't just be part of a practical meal and part of a custom that we do in the ancient Mediterranean world. And then I think, well, is this some kind of ritual purification? Is this some kind of preparation for Jesus' death? Is there something that needs to happen before that moment? Is it a kind of cleansing? In which case, though, what is being cleansed, And so we go back and forth about these different meanings if we're reading in between the details of the stories. And then we could also say, well, is it just meant to honor someone? Is Jesus honoring his disciples? Because a foot washing of someone else is to honor them, again, within the ancient Mediterranean. But that's not quite right either, because if they were honoring someone, you wouldn't wash their feet with water. You would do it with oil, or with wine, actually, was more common. So what is going on? I read through this passage and I say, what is going on? Well, there's a couple of things that I guess are usual and unusual, and that's what those details of the culture of the time help us show. But then on the other hand, I don't know that we can really go wrong if there is right or wrong. I don't know if we can really go wrong by saying, well, clearly this is some kind of service for each other. And I think we saw that so beautifully just now again with the message to the children. But clearly it has something to do with showing a moment of service. And what is that? And I wanted to share with you today, I ran across this wonderful South African scholar. His name's Jan van der Walt, South African theologian who has spent some time recently with this passage, with this foot washing moment. And I love what he does with it because I remember growing up in my home church in Colorado, and when we heard stories like this, it was, we were good German Russian Mennonites. Every story means humility, right? And so we read this story and we said, this is the humility of Jesus. This is the humility that we have. We do this out of humility, and that is the reason. And I think that's true. On the other hand, though, here comes a South African theologian, Jan van der Walt, and he says, wake up, everyone. It's not about humility at all. It's about love. And then me, the German Russian Mennonite, I'm saying, what's the difference between humility and love? What is the difference between serving someone out of humility versus serving them out of love? And having trouble seeing any difference in that at all. But Jan van der Walt says, no. We got to read it for what it is. And at the end of this passage, when Jesus says, this is the example for you, this is the example for what we should do, at the end of that story, Jesus says that, and he says it not because you should do this because of humility, but he says, I am teacher and Lord. I have authority. And so you do this too. But it's not out of humility, it's out of authority that we do it. And I think, this doesn't make any sense to me. I'm a Mennonite, you know? And so again, what is the difference between serving someone out of love versus serving them out of humility? And what is authority versus that? So these are the things that are in my head as I'm reading this story. I think another thing that I find kind of related to this and meaningful about this comes from another theologian. And I don't know kind of how many different ways there have been in the world over thousands of years to think about what foot washing is. But there's a really also wonderful church historian and theologian, and his name is Thomas O'Loughlin. He has kind of taken this story perhaps in a different direction from his own tradition. He's a British Catholic. And to me, it speaks to me because he also says, well, I learned this story differently growing up. I learned foot washing differently growing up than he thinks of it now. Because when he was growing up, kind of similarly actually to my upbringing, he said, well, this is a moment, this is a foot washing ritual. We may do it once a year, we may do it twice a year, and it is to kind of symbolize the humility of service, and that's how he also described it. And I found that very relevant, I found that very great. And then he, only in the past few years, has said, I also got it wrong. He says, I got it wrong because it's not, again, so much about humility, but he calls it a radical statement of equality as opposed to humility. So Thomas O'Loughlin, he says, no, foot washing, he says, a radical statement of equality. And I had to think about that for a while, too. I'm thinking about Jan van der Watt, I'm thinking about Thomas O'Loughlin, I'm trying to figure this out. And when he says it's about equality, well, okay. But what kind of equality? And so what he is pulling from within his education and Catholic tradition, are two examples that he really pulls from. One, he goes all the way back to the medieval period, and he goes all the way back to the 10th century, and he says in the 10th century, bishops of the church would take at least one Sunday out of their year, and the bishops would come down off the stage, and they would wash the feet of the homeless, anyone who was homeless within the medieval church. They would wash their feet. Anyone who was most impoverished, most in poverty, the bishop would wash their feet in the 9th century. And that practice fell out of practice a few centuries later. But then now, the other example that Thomas O'Loughlin pulls from his tradition is about a very, actually not too long ago, papal statement. I don't know, guys, if we heard of this back in 2016, if we heard of this back in January 2016, which was the first time the papacy in Catholic tradition had formally proclaimed that women as well as men could have foot washing done to them or done with them on Holy Thursday, on the Holy Week in Holy Thursday. And 2016 is the first time that was formally proclaimed by a pope in the Catholic Church. And so when Thomas O'Loughlin comes in and he's thinking about these more recent moments, he's thinking about a long-time tradition of foot washing, and it is incredible. I love this kind of thing, everybody. It's like so ancient, such an ancient practice, but done in so many different ways. And so for the Catholic Church, it is kind of much more recently in their minds within Catholic tradition as a moment of equality, as saying that. And by the way, a lot of Catholic churches were already doing foot washing with everybody. They didn't need the papal statement to include women, But in that moment, it is formally stated by the papacy. And so, to me, I see these different strands coming in, and I'm asking these questions about, well, on the one hand, there is a difference. There is some kind of difference between how we serve each other. Are we doing it because of equality? Are we doing it because of authority to be able to serve? Are we doing it because of humility, because it's an obligation, not that humility is just that? Are we doing it out of love, or are we doing it out of all of these things? And it helps me coming in with humility in my head as the main meaning of all things, It helps me from coming from that tradition to see what other traditions have been doing with foot washing recently. I want to just show us, let me see if I can make slides work. I want to show us a few images too that have helped me think about what foot washing can be. And here's one of them from Pope Francis back in 2024. Pope Francis was famous as being one of the popes that has gone to a lot of different locations specifically for the purpose of foot washing. Here's an image of him in a prison outside of Rome, and he went there deliberately to wash the inhabitants of the prison, their feet, especially women's feet, at that moment in 2024. And he does so kind of what we, should expect, perhaps, from our church leaders, to show that moment of service as the Pope to women in prison. But then on the other hand, it's not just the Pope, right? It's not just the bishops, it's not just this cardinal, who also very famously washed the feet of his congregation in 2023. But it's not just leaders, right, around the world that need to do this, to say what is service, what is real equality and love, and that kind of moment and foundation for service. And so, of course, it has become something much wider in recent years, And I love this example too, everybody. I love this example. Staying with the Catholics for just a moment. I love this example, though, because foot washing has become a moment of interreligious and interfaith unity, and something that shows that. Here we have just one example of that, where you have someone going out of their way to say, can I wash the feet of my neighbors who are Muslim and who are Hindu and who are, of multiple traditions, even outside of this biblically based tradition of foot washing, to say, well, that is what service is, That may not have been what Jesus and the disciples as Jews were thinking of in that moment when they did foot washing in the first century, but it has become something that is that service for all people, or can be that. And then finally, I find it very meaningful sometimes to look at other moments, other rituals that also have to do with this washing idea, or washing of each other. Again, we're going beyond biblical context, and yet there's something similar, there's something comparable about that moment of thinking about what is loving service, how do you demonstrate it, how do you embed it within yourself, within ourselves. And so I think of things like a very, very ancient Hindu marriage ritual in which the parents of the people being married will come and wash their feet and their hands in that moment of service to them as they are getting married. And I think, of course, of Muslim daily prayer practice, in which the washing of the feet and washing of other parts of the body, the cleansing of it, the readiness for prayer is such an important part. And there we have again the idea of entering the sacred space, or what does that mean? And then finally, last example, I love this one, because in Jakarta, Indonesia, in December 22 every year, children wash the feet of their mothers on what is essentially a Mother's Day celebration, to honor what that person is to them and to show service through love to someone else. And so foot washing, when I read this story from John, foot washing is just so at the center of my mind. And there's so many other things happening in the story at this moment besides just that foot washing. But all of the meaning kind of combines when I see this ritual done and when I hear this story, because it is something very powerful, I think, about what is that moment of love, and what is that moment of saying, I'm not doing this because I am lower than you, but I am doing this because we are equal, and that is what enables love to be real love, is equality, and is service through equality in that way. And so I still am kind of a little bit uncertain about some of this, because I much prefer the humility interpretation still, because of my own tradition. But at the same time, I think there is something more going on, even more, than saying, okay, we serve each other, because it is one thing that we can do to be humble before each other. I think it can be even more than that. So to that extent, I think these examples help us with that as well. Now, everybody, I don't know, someone tell me, actually, does this church do foot washing? Do we try it? Okay. Well, I don't know. Some churches around here do, and some don't. I think everybody. I mean, the lucky thing for some of us is that Jesus, at the end, when he says, "Do this," that this is an example that you should also do. Those other details I mentioned earlier about how he's doing it in the middle of the meal and not before the meal, and how he's doing it, kind of in a ritual way by taking off his outer robe and then putting it back on. This shows us service, But the early church, maybe like some of our churches now, did not decide that that the example meant we need to do foot washing every Sunday, right? So that's actually pretty new, a new idea for some churches. However, it is wonderful for us to be able to have that question in front of us, that question of what can we do that similarly to what foot washing meant, to what it really meant, What are the things that we can do every day that are something about naming and showing and living, not just humility and not just love even, but love within that equality and that service to others in that way. So I would, wonder if you ever do try it as a church, or if you do it, invite me back so I can come and see how you guys choose to do it, because I'd love to see that. But I thank you for considering this scripture with me, and thank you for having me today.